This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, well, I confess. It's really my great pleasure to introduce Leticia about Arroyo. She's one of rare aves. Is a historian and an economic historian of Latin America. She did her BA in economics at the Universidad Católica in Buenos Aires. Went to the US for an MA in Latin American Studies at the University of Kansas. And then to California to work with Peter Lindert and Alan Taylor on her PhD in economics from University of California at Davis. And her dissertation looked at the not much with this in particular, but in a more general fashion, the links between globalization, growth, and inequality in Latin America since the 19th century. And as you see from the title, she's pursuing a further research agenda on the determinants of economic growth and development in the long run. In particular, the interaction between economic development and economic growth, looking at inequality, living standards, education, and institutions. So it's a pretty ambitious research agenda, of which we have a first preliminary version, I guess, of a paper she's writing while she is visiting the LSE about education and educational policies in Peru, 1876-1940. Welcome, Leticia.
I'm not a rock star, so I cannot deal with microphones. Well, it only can go down from here, so thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm starting this new project about Peru, and there are many Peruvians and Peruvianists here in the room, so I feel I'm just giving an exam now. So we'll see what you have to say after this. So as Alejandra said, I'm an economic historian, which means that I cannot speak without graphs, and I apologize. Is the occupational hazard, and hopefully you will understand them. In economics, we have this very rude thing that people interrupt all the time when you're giving a presentation. We're barbarians that way, and I know that you are very civil. But if you have any clarification questions, please by all means ask. I'm used to the rudeness of people when I present, so I don't know what I'm going to do with myself without interruption. So, but in any case, so I'm going to talk about education, and what I would like to give you is an economic view of education to start with. So there have been some seminal papers in the 1980s in the economics profession that actually identified human capital accumulation as one of the engines of economic growth. Education, that is one of the ways to accumulate human capital, is linked to actually higher levels of income per capita, higher economic development. As you can see on the graph on your right, you have that countries that have higher average years of schooling just are associated with higher income per capita levels. But even though economists, we are now obsessed with the role of education, education is also not just a channel for economic growth, but it also is a tool for intergenerational income distribution. And this is where equality comes into place, a topic that I'm really interested in. And this is where we have to consider not just, education as an economic issue, but also as a political issue. So we have seen economists generally look at the role of education in outcomes later in life. For example, if you have more education, then you have better job opportunities and better earnings, and your children as well. But other social scientists look at education as a ways of changing aspirations and also behaviors of different segments of the population. So education, as I said before, is not just an economic issue, it's also a political issue, and it's a source and vehicle of power. And because of this inextricable connection between these two dimensions, we can actually maybe shed some light in why is it that if education is actually so beneficial, then we still see today millions of children that are not part of the educational system or drop out of school early. So what I'm interested in here is not only just look, from an economic perspective, but actually look at what we call the political economy. So just look at the intersection between economics and politics into determining different outcomes for Peru in this period of time. In terms of education, there have been a lot of studies lately, especially dealing with Latin America, that have identified the gap in earnings due to lack of access or unequal access to education. And this is especially relevant for societies that are divided along ethnic and racial lines. For the case of Peru, it's been estimated in the last couple of decades that there is a 50% of the earnings gap between indigenous and non-indigenous population is due to education. So, in this project, which is very, very new, I've been actually compiling data for a longer period of time than I care to confess, but I'm just looking at Peru during the 1876 and 1940 period because this period of Peruvian history is extremely interesting in terms of all the events that have been happening from a political perspective and an educational perspective. So Peru experienced with different levels of decentralization in the educational system. It also changed the electoral laws to limit the suffrage to male adults that were literate. And then it issued a wide array of educational laws that some of them were actually put into practice. So what I have gathered in order to look at this project is district-based data on educational outcomes in political participation for Peru for this period of time. So that, most of you probably know this, but Peru politically is divided in big regions that are called departments, then smaller regions that are called provinces, and smaller political units that are called districts or municipalities. In 1876, we were around 800 districts, and then there was a huge movement towards making more and more districts, especially during the late 19th century. And by 1940, we have, I think, 1,100 districts. So I just have to tell you this so you know how much data I just actually put together. It's a lot of data. So, but I will show you some of it today. So, where did I come from this issue? Why am I interested in this? So, well, I've been motivated from different strands of literature. One of them that has been haunting me since I started my PhD in economics. So in economic history and economics, there's been an array of studies in the last 15, 20 years, 15 probably is more accurate, that actually talk about persistence of institutions over time. And you historians are going to say, yes, we know that the institutions persist, so what's new with that? Well, the question is how long they persist, so how long the arm of history could be. And in this case, I claim that it's extremely long, like 400 years long. So, in this particular, all these studies kind of have their different takes on the length of the arm and how the arm moves, but the basic flavor is the same. So once upon a time, there was a colonizing power establishing, it just faced different environments in the Americas, and as a consequence, establishing institutions. Some institutions were better than others, and these institutions, in some way or fashion that is not very clear, persisted over time and determine, or as they say, heavily influence economic outcomes today. These economic outcomes can range from income per capita, so at the country level, to nutrition, to education. For Latin America, there are two particular studies that speak to the topic that I'm talking about today. One is by Dell and Melissa Dell in 2010, and the other one is by Gallego in 2010 as well. Melissa Dell actually looked at the case of Chile, and it looked at districts that were within what she called a meta boundary. And MITA was, for those that you don't know, is an institution during colonial times. It was a forced drafted labor to work in the mines. That institution was particularly extractive, as they call it, so particularly egalitarian, and she claims that those districts that were within that MITA boundary actually fared much, much worse in 1993 than the districts that did not have that MITA. So this is for Peru, so district level data. So Arroyo, just in the same year, he looked at the Americas overall, and he was interested in the provision of education. He looked at national units, and he was interested in democracy and political centralization as factors determining provision of education later. And on the right-hand side, this is taken from his paper. You see that he claims that there is a positive relationship between the level of provision of education at the year 1900 and and much later on in the late 20th century. The connection that he does with institutions is that the provision of education depended on two main variables, as we say, democracy and political participation, but those variables were actually measured by institutions during colonial times, and he used settler mortality, so the probability of that if you settle in one place that you would die. So if you would die, you actually want to get rich very quickly before you die. And then also the share of indigenous population available in the area. So the other two strands of literature that motivate my work are one deals with the extension of franchise and the development of mass education, and the other one, the issues of decentralization and efficiency and the provision of schooling. And so in terms of the extension of franchise, we see many episodes in history that are associated with the expansion of education and later success in terms of economic growth. Examples of that is the U.S., not today, the educational system is terrible, but late 19th century, early 20th century, it was pretty good, and also the European experience, especially the Scandinavian countries. So this literature leads with the extension of the suffrage or the position of suffrage restrictions, and how the lead tries to control, limit, or develop mass education. Then the other strand of literature that is particularly in vogue in the last 10 or 20 years is the issue of decentralization. As you know, many Latin American countries had decentralized their educational systems in the last 20 years or so. And there was a large literature that said that decentralization was extremely good. Why? Because you made the size of the state pretty small. We were talking about countries coming from imports substitution centralization policies where the state was pretty large, and also providing some legitimacy to local government. However, some studies claim that this decentralization fashion may be exaggerated because it does really depend on the role of the local government and the concentration of power. So these are the three strands of literature that I am just putting together in order to analyze this particular case. So let me just tell you where we're going from here. So first I'm going to give you a very, very brief description of the Peru's educational system. And then I'm going to give you a very even shorter theoretical framework so that you understand how I'm framing the facts and the ideas and the data that I have. Then I'm going to attack you with a lot of graphs, show you all the data not all the data, I showed some restraint actually. Some of the data that I have, so I'm going to show the general trends for Peru as a country, then in comparative perspective to see how Peru was faring with respect to other Latin American countries, and then within Peru, which is one of the things where the data set that I have actually has a comparative advantage. Then I'm just going to give some insights of how we can explain the divergence in educational outcomes that we observe in Peru during this period of time. Okay, let's get going. So, the first honest attempt to expand an educational apparatus in Peru started in the 1860s, part of the Guano proceedings were allocated to education. And so according to Espinosa, we observed some improvement, so an increase in enrollment during this period of time. And then when the funds coming from WANA started to vanish, then the government decided to experiment with the decentralization phase. Mariátegui calls it that this is a way that Peru wants to actually modernize the country so that it can eliminate or just reduce the power of colonial elites. This decentralization phase starts in 1873 with the law of municipalities and ends in 1905. But there are two ways of decentralization that I'll talk about in just a minute. And then it is followed by a centralization period that just basically extends until throughout the 20th century. There have been some projects to decentralize the education since then, but they had different levels of decentralization. But in any case, so here you have a table with the main laws that Peru passed that are relevant to the study. So you have the most important ones in in the 1873, which is the law of municipalities, was the decentralization of the school system. And then you had the 1905, that you had the centralization of public-private education that came with the provision of compulsory or free education. Free education was actually a mandate before that. There had to be schools in the district capitals before that, but it was not really enforced that much. So let's start with the decentralization education. This is what I call the jure actually decentralization. Before 1873, it was actually a de facto decentralization. Even though the central government was providing funds, it had a minor supervisory role, and each of the districts was in charge of education, including designing the curricula and also appointing teachers. But in 1873, as facing the realities of drying of revenues from WANO, as Contreras called it, this was like a forced move. They had to do it, they didn't have the money, and so Lima, as he says, Lima was poor, the provinces were rich, so let's outsource the problem. So the districts, what they could do, they could collect taxes, they had to administer local services. These services included education, bad road maintenance, welfare, and healthcare. And for financial support, the local government would apportion 2/3 of the direct taxes, and also they would increase 2 percentage points of the import tariffs. If you just look at the law, actually there is a very specific way that these 2 percentage points were to be allocated. These 2 percentage points, 7% had to go to, so 10% had to go to Lima, the other 10% had to go to Cusco, and then the other departments had a lower participation, which is interesting because in terms of population, Lima was bigger, but Cusco was not as big as Lima, or just bigger than the other departments, but that's another story. In any case, so that's the first round of decentralization. The second round of decentralization is 1886. Once again, the central government is bankrupt after the War of the Pacific. According to the memories of the central government, you have that during the War of the Pacific, especially the last 2 years, the government spent 0 pesos. It was pesos like that, yeah. Pesos into education, and so now it's like, okay, we're going to go even further in terms of the decentralization, but this is going to be a department-based decentralization. So the department had to administer education, public works, healthcare and welfare, etc. And the collection of taxes had included personal taxes, land taxes, and real estate alcabala. There was also the restatement of the poll tax. Remember that poll tax had existed in the colonial times, and then it was abolished because it was, it reminded you of the exploitation of the indigenous population. Well, now it's back. And then, but this decentralization had, still the central government has some control. This control manifested in two main ways. One is that the Congress had to approve the budget, and also it was going to appoint the chair of the department board. And also the other way is that the executive participated in the Superior Council that was the one that was responsible for curricular decisions. So now, in 1905, even though before 1905 there were some efforts to centralize education, they didn't happen. But with 1905, there's the centralization of the primary education, and with this law, we inaugurate the teaching state, or how Carlos Newlands likes to call it, the Estado Docente in Peru. The teaching state existed in other Latin American countries before 1905, and some of the characteristics that took in Peru were also common to other Latin American countries. There was this strive to fight barbarism and to civilize the indigenous populations. However, this was done in not in an extremely egalitarian way, as we will see with the data shows. So, as the Minister of Education, Paulo, in 1906 said that we have to actually provide education in order to have true democracy. So, how did decentralization take place? So, the law had a provision that education had to be free and compulsory. The government had purview over pretty much everything, so management, funding, and supervision. And the government, how is the government going to pay for it? So it earmarked some revenue, like the mojonazgo, that is like local school tax. And then it committed that 5% of the total federal revenue would have to go to education, and 30% of the department revenue as well. So this this seems like a pretty big commitment. You have zero, in the War of the Pacific, which is understandable. But before the levels, I haven't found very specific data about education, but it was never 5% of the revenue. It was just at most it was 3%. So with that, the background of the educational system in Peru, let me just tell you how my theoretical framework works, and it's very easy and it's very simple. So one of the topics I'm interested in is the question of centralization and decentralization. When there's decentralization, basically the government is just given power to a subnational government, and this subnational government organizes the provision of a public service, in this case education. When there is no centralization, when there's no decentralization, everything is centralized, so this middle part goes away. Now the question is, why would a government actually give power away to the subnational unit? And some of the reasons are just to grant legitimacy to local government. It could be also because to grant stability to the system. If the local government is not really aligning with the central government, maybe just by granting some autonomy is going to provide more stability. Now, in all that the decentralization experiences, one of the key issues that scholars have identified is the question of voice and accountability. So decentralization could work very well if there's accountability from the providers to the community, to the national government. So this is where political participation, comes in this whole study. So the question is, if you're providing a service and there's no accountability to the subnational government or to the national government, is that level of provision of that service going to be optimal or not? And because of Peru, we have one dimension that is decentralization, and the other dimension is political participation that actually changed with a new electoral law that restricted suffrage. So these two dimensions are the ones I'm going to play with and going to look at in the case of Peru. So now let's start with the data. This is where I have a lot of fun. So what data do I have? So I have district level data from the national censuses of 1876 and 1940, and the education national census of 1902. I need to give a special note to consideration to the 1902 census. This was, born before the decentralization movement. It was actually done by the government to have an idea of what the educational system looked like. But the government didn't want to spend money to actually have the census. So it was relying on the educational apparatus that existed in Peru to get that education, to get that information. So each department and each province had, and each district had to provide that information to the central government. Many of the districts did not comply. The central government said that they didn't want to actually spend money in getting the census, saying that it was extremely expensive, and then citing that Argentina for the 1895 census needed 100 people full-time and that they couldn't afford that. So the result was that over only 700 districts reported, which meant that it reached 90% of the population and 2/3 of the territory of Peru. And still we have 700 districts, but still it's incomplete. So we have to take that into account. And then we have the electoral census in 1933, which I actually discovered magically in the British Library when I was here first, and it was one of the greatest things that happened to me in London. I know, I love data. So when I find a new source of data, I get extremely excited. You have to ask Alejandra, the day I found it. So what I find, what is really cool about the electoral census is that it has district level data on voters, registered voters, and turnout. So, and for the province level, you have data also on education level of the voters and ethnicity. And on the department level, you have occupations. So I'm going to show you some data, think of this. And then I complemented all this district level data with some statistical yearbooks from the Education Ministry and also from the Statistical Direction Office in Peru. Also that I found a bunch of them at the British Library. So that to give you an idea of what my data is and the laws that are important. Here you have like a timeline, and this is important because we economists like what we call like natural historical experiments or quasi-experiments. So in order to measure the effect of one reform, we need data before and after, right? And so this one kind of gives you that. So we're good, basically. So that you have an idea. So now let's go to data, and I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs, but then I have a summary slide just in case you got lost. So what happened in terms of literacy and of course illiteracy in Peru during this period of time? So in 1876, 82% of the population in Peru was illiterate. By 1940, this decreased, but still it was like 48% of the population, no, 52%, sorry. 52% of the population was illiterate by 1940. So there was a huge improvement, so you have many, like 30 percentage points improvement within a period of time where there's a huge demographic expansion in Peru. What happened in terms of input? So one thing, what I show you the literacy as an educational outcome, what happened? So if you think of, as a sausage making machine, so you need schools, you need teachers in order to actually create literacy. So what happened is a period of time. So in this period of time, and I have data only starting at mid-19-teens, we have a substantial improvement in the construction of schools. It goes from around 2002 and 1943 to almost 7,000. So there is a significant improvement, and so there is a commitment of the central government to build more schools, and you see it there. What I have, this goes hand in hand of how many students go to school. So in order to improve literacy, you actually need more kids going to school. So you see that also have one isolated data point in 1890, but you see like, well, it's impressive. Look at how many students go to school now, starting from 1876 and 1900s. But the problem is that you're only reaching just as, one small share of all the school-age children. So basically, By 1940, only 33% of the children that they were in school age went to school, which means that 2/3 of the children did not go to school. Even though you saw those impressive lines going up, it's like the reach was actually not that deep. And more males than females went to school as well. You see like the light gray column there. So as a sum up, so that in case you got lost in all those graphs. So we have higher literacy levels during this period of time. We have more school, we have enrollment, but still we're only reaching almost 1/3 of the school age population. How does this compare internationally? So Peru comes what is called the second wave of mass education in Latin America. The first wave is given by Uruguay and Argentina, which are the front runners in terms of literacy and mass education. And this is followed by Peru, Mexico, and Bolivia. And the third generation is basically Central America. But if you just look at the data right here, maybe it gives a better idea if you control a little bit by the concentration of indigenous populations. So these are illiteracy rates, so lower is better. So we have that in the case of Bolivia, 72% of the population was illiterate, compared to Peru was 58%. So Peru did better than Bolivia, but it did worse than Mexico, for example. So now the next step, that this is where I'm trying to exploit the data set that I have, is to look at trends within Peru. And this is where I'm just testing how good your eyesight is. For an economist, this is not bad. I've seen worse tables than this. But I cannot show you district level data. I'm going to show you some graphs of district level because they're now 1100. So what I'm showing you here is actually department level data. And you have literacy levels were reported for 1876 and 1940. For 1902 was educational census, so it only just had information of children going to school. So I'm not showing you here, but I show you in other tables. So you have schooling that was reported in 1902, 1940, and then attendance. That attendance is from the statistical yearbooks, and I only have data for the 1920s, so I did an average of the 1920s. So what are the trends that we see here? So let's look at Puno and Apurimac. So you see that by the 1940, they can achieve literacy rates of double digits. They start at very low levels of literacy, and then they reach to almost 11%, both of them. Who are the overachievers in the country? Surprise, Lima and Callao. So look at the level of literacy of Callao, which is almost 80% of the population was literate. This goes hand in hand of how many children went to school. So look at that, 84.5% of the school age children went to school in Callao, versus looking at Purimac, only 15% of the children actually went to school. In terms of attendance, if you just do some kind of eyeball average, you'll see that there's as much difference in terms of variability in the outcomes as you see in terms of literacy levels. And I'll come back to that later when I'm trying to explain why we observe these trends in Peru. If you want to look in terms of geography, I calculated the average of literacy by the typical regions in Peru, so coastal, Sierra, and jungle. So you see that the coastal levels had higher literacy levels than the jungle, and the jungle had higher literacy levels than the Sierra. So you have an idea of what's going on in that sense, and so I can show you my map GIS doing skills in the process. No, they're not very good, but good enough to make that. So, but one of the issues that I just wanted to explore in this paper is how Peru, that is a society that had high levels of concentration of indigenous populations in particular areas, fared in terms of educational outcomes during this period of time. So what this data allow me to do is to look at educational outcomes such as literacy and schooling by district. And in those districts, what also I have is the ethnic and racial composition. So basically, in 1876, people were classified as white, mestizo, black, yellow, and indigenous, or Indian, we call it. In 1940, they had white and mestizo as one category altogether. They claimed that they couldn't distinguish whether it was white or mestizo. It was not self-reported. It was the census person just said, like, oh, you actually look black. So that's how they classify people. And so there were just so what I did is just look at literacy and schooling data based on the concentration of non-white population. And non-white is basically I put in white as white and mestizo together, and then just the rest. So here you have. Let me just explain this a little bit better. So this is the mean. So it's the average of literacy for all the districts. I have 757 districts in 1976. This is an idea of the variability, the standard deviation of these observations. In 1940, there's 1,059 districts, and the average literacy is 0.30. So if you remember, if you have really good memory, you remember the data, that I showed you for earlier, for the whole country. The literacy level for the whole country was 18%. But if you just look at district level, it's actually 13%. One of the questions that you may want to ask me later is how big a district is. Some districts are really small. The average population in district in 1876 was 3,500 people, and in 1940 was about 5,500. So that now you have an idea. So in 1940, the literacy rate was 30%. It was also, on average, by district is lower than the whole country. Now we can look at the same data, but just as it slices their population according to the concentration of indigenous populations, and you see that, for example, in 1876, in districts where you have a low concentration of indigenous population, the literacy level was much higher, 13 percentage points. I don't even know how to, 15 percentage points. I don't know how to add anymore. Than in those districts where 70%, 75% or more of the population was indigenous. What happened in 1940? In 1940, we observed the same pattern, but the gap is much bigger. Yes, there are different, number of districts, so I can actually just show it in other ways, which I do in the paper. But you see that this gap widens later in 1940. So the same patterns we can observe, in terms of schooling, just in the districts where more concentration of indigenous population, you have that more high concentration, you have lower literacy, lower schooling rates or enrollment overall. So now this is this is a graph where I show you all the data points. Those 1,059 points here and 857 points there. Basically, what this is showing you is that all the data from 0% non-white or 0% to 100% non-white. So here, the farther you go to the right, the more concentration of indigenous population. So what this is telling, basically, it shows you a few things. For example, in 1940, you have a bunch of districts that are on the zero, right? And I double checked because what's going on here? Or actually, there were some districts where you only had white and mestizos. There were many more districts than in 1876. So what you see in this period of time is that you have that more districts are actually becoming whiter. But you see that the indigenous, the districts that were having high concentration of indigenous population become, relatively speaking, more illiterate. The line that you see here is basically a trend. You see here that the line is steeper in 1940 than in 1976. This means that if you go from 40% of non-white to 60% in 1940, this is going to yield a lower level of literacy than it would have yielded in 1876. Did you follow me there? If not, I have another graph. And this concludes the scary, graph part of the presentation. So now, how much time I have? So I have how much time? So, now that you know everything you need to know about the educational system in Peru, let's try to explain what happened during this period of time, and in particular how centralization and political participation could be factors responsible for these outcomes. So I'm an economist, so we all look at supply and demand. I know it's a cliche, but we actually do that. So could it be that it's a demand issue? So people do not want education, right? So they won't demand it. So if you don't demand it, then you're not going. The provision, the outcome is going to be low. Like think about like demand and supply of apples. If you don't demand it, the price goes down. The same thing goes here. If you don't demand education, the outcome would be that the literacy is low. The other could be that there's low supply of the educational services. The demand is there, but the government is not supplying that. So let's just try to find evidence for this different aspect. So it's a question of low demand. So what I observe is that the districts that are rural, they have low literacy level. This could be because children were needed for agricultural chores, so they would not attend to school regularly. So the quantitative evidence points that attendance would be the indicator that would show most likely that children may be enrolled to school, but they would not go regularly. But if you just remember the table, I'm sure you have photographic memory. The variability of attendance was not that huge. They would not really go one-to-one to actual literacy levels or schooling. And also, I found evidence for anecdotal evidence that in different parts of the country there were demands for higher education. Not only from the indigenous perspective, from the indigenous groups, but also from the emergence of the middle class during this period of time. So maybe then it's a question of low supply. And in order to assess whether there were enough schools, what we need to figure out is how many schools we need in order to serve all the school-age population. Because if we just look at the number of schools per the student that attended, you're actually seeing an outcome. So what we need to know is potentially how many schools we need. And so I did that calculation. So I have the school age population, and I said, okay, let's say that I want to match the schooling, the enrollment of Tacna, let's say that had a high literacy level. And I'm going to see how many schools I need in Puno in order to actually achieve that same enrollment. And what I found is that in Puno I had 1.8 schools per 1,000 children, while in Tacna actually I had 8 schools per 1,000 children. So clearly there is a discrepancy here, and I'm just making back of the envelope calculations. I'm not taking into account topography. In the mountainous areas, you would need more schools in order to allow equal access. So the other issue is, okay, let's see. The government said I'm going to allocate 5% of the revenues to education. I said, okay, fine. That's fantastic. Let's see if the government actually did that. So what I calculated was the spending of education overall, all the spending that the government did, and I found that from 1908 onwards, it just hovered around 6%. right? It's like, okay, it's consistent, right? And this is a period of time where the revenue in Peru the central government in Peru was going pretty, it was growing pretty fast. So even though 6% you say is constant, is there more funds coming in? Because the funds were increasing over time. But let's see how the government spent in other areas. So for example, in War and Navy. So the blue line is education, and the red line that stops in 1930 because I haven't found more data, but I'm looking, is for War and Navy. So, okay, let's not take 1900s, maybe just, War of the Pacific, still remnants of the War of the Pacific, but let's go, to the low point there, that is 16%. 6% versus 16%. So this is how the government was allocating resources. Clearly, as we say, economists say, this is a revealed preference. This is what you prefer spending. So, if we agree, if I have convinced you, you will tell me later, that is if there's a low supply of education, of educational services, we have to find factors that actually had something to do with this low provision. So here you have a newspaper article from 1914 that says that what Peru needs is more schools. So it's not that I'm just imagining it. It seems that it was the perception was the same. So I'm just going to, trying to convince you that this whole thing of decentralization and political participation had something to do in terms of this low provision of educational services. And how to do it in like 6 minutes or so. So let's just look at the decentralization period, de facto de jure, so it was pre-1876 until 1905. So what we have is that the local elites were in charge of provision of education. These local elites were not very interested in providing schooling to indigenous population in particular. This quote is very telling. It says that people are in Puno. I'm not sure why I'm picking on Puno, poor Puno, but they're just like wild animals, and the people that are, they call themselves educated, are just drunk all the time. So there was not this kind of high view of indigenous population. There's also evidence that the local government did not spend all the money that Lima sent to provide education. They also challenged some of the initiatives that Lima initiated in Piura, Puno, and Cusco. The central government gave funds to hire German teachers, and the departments were not the local elites were not very happy about it, and the whole situation ended up with one of the teachers in jail because it had weird behavior, and then it just later dismissal of this teacher. After all, so there are instances of rebellion or just challenging of the central government authority. What happened with centralization? So we know that centralization is also inspired by other factors, such as this wave of nationalization, of nationalism in Peru, especially after the War of the Pacific. This hemispheric-wide view of modernization, of just fighting the barbarians and modernizing the country. There's also a question of demand, especially from the middle classes, that saw the expansion of the educational system as their opportunity for their children to actually just get a college degree. This was also fueled because Peru had a wonderful recovery. In the beginning of the 20th century, it just, guano died, nitrates were lost, but other export commodities soared, and the main source of revenue for the government is customs, so that made more funds available to spend. And also it's a question of political power. The central government wanted to have more power on the local governments. So what I think that happened is that all this centralization, what actually resulted into was that the local elites accepted the money from Lima and extended their patronage networks during this period of time, which led to an unequal provision of education. So if we just take into account the issue of political participation, where you have that the suffrage is actually restricted. So you have that the loop part of the centralization and decentralization with accountability is just not working because the indigenous population are mostly illiterate and they don't vote. So throughout this system of centralization, what you have is there is an expansion of educational services. The elites were not extremely happy to do it, but they did not completely obliterate the movement. But the result was unequal access. And I'm going to conclude now. So just to recap what happened during this period of time. So we had the decentralization period where you have local elite power that did not value education. They had no incentive to provide it and did not provide it. And then you have the centralized period where you have a negotiation between the local and national power, and that resulted into unequal educational provision. How does this fit with all the motivation of the literature that I talked before? So one is just discussing the issue of decentralization as a panacea. It's just really decentralization the way to go in order to grant mass access to the population, to education. It doesn't seem that when local power is concentrated, it doesn't seem that works. The other, these results also speak to how political participation is a channel for equality in terms of the relationship between voting and provision of social services. If you have a more inclusive electorate, you will have pressure to provide some social services. And then finally, it speaks to the question of the role of the elites. Many of these persistence type of papers assume that an elite was national and there was no local elite and there was no negotiation between the two. So if you have a national elite that decides policies, then you will have that either you have that the central elite just is in favor of education, centralizes and provides it, or if you have that it doesn't provide it at all. So this whole persistence and very like broad picture kind of papers actually just lose this kind of distinction between local and national elites and how they negotiate the power structure and provide services for the population. And I'm done.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I think I have a number of questions and so on. Thank you very much for having put all this much together in the last few weeks. I'm amazed, and I like very much the idea and the findings. But I would refer to the audience that is much better equipped than myself to comment on Peruvian education policy and outcomes and relations of the elites and central or the central government. Any question there? Oh, please.
Well, thank you. I suppose in some ways what you've presented confirms what we think we know about this. Right? In that, yes, Peruvian education has been very deficient. It's been reflected a highly stratified society, and access has been differentiated, spatially and ethnically, etc. I suppose I'm interested in towards your sort of conclusion about the role of local elites, and it seems to me that given that you have all this data, it might be interesting to look either at the district or provincial level and see, perhaps a few case studies where, because you did point to significant variation across provinces in terms of literacy rates, etc., and in some ways those rates match or map onto levels of indigeneity, if you like. But I wonder if there's a case for, I guess, exogenizing the role of these local elites, looking at it more carefully, and perhaps comparing two provinces where local elites either contributed to or hindered development of primary education, and seeing whether this had different results. Because I think if you did that, then you would be in a stronger position to argue that what determines ultimately the success of or the failure of educational provision is this mediating role of the local elite. So I know this is still preliminary stuff, but it sounded to me like that might be one way to take this further.
Well, thank you. First of all, thanks for letting me know that I didn't butcher your history, so that I did understand it correctly. That is a huge relief among everything. And I think that what I want to do moving forward is things that economists do, that we run regressions to see how these things are associated, and that's because it gives me like some street cred. But beyond that, I'm really interested in just looking at regional histories and see how different provinces there is some literature. I know there's literature on Lima by Espinosa, and there's stuff on Puno by Hazen. So I can see myself just looking at case studies in order to actually exploit this variation within Peru. But yeah, that's absolutely a wonderful suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, following on Pablo's remarks, I agree completely that you've kind of put a lot of flesh to things that we've always suspected about this education. I mean, these are general trends, but now we can see them with a much sharper focus, and I think that's very needed and very important. And also, I think it challenges certain view that these studies can't be done because there's no information. I think that you've kind of proven that the information is there, and if you're willing to put the time and effort to organize it, you can actually extrapolate a lot of very interesting data that you can then use to prove trends that we might suspect, but we now can say for sure these are the percentages, these were the people that were studying. So I think that it's very important. I really want to thank you for that kind of effort, because I think that in a lot of times Peruvians don't do these large scale number things because there's a lot of effort involved putting them together.
Saying we're lazy.
No, I think a lot of the material is dispersed, and some people claim that it's lost. I mean, when I started my studies, they told me I shouldn't bother because I wouldn't find anything. That there was nothing on the 19th century. And I was, well, if you look hard enough, there's plenty. Actually, the problem is the opposite. There's too much, and you don't really know what to do with that data. But you've organized it, and that's really useful. But I would follow on to how you can mine what you've done, and I think that following on to Paulo's suggestion, I think that a very interesting way of doing it is, as you say, with regional histories, there's some that have already been done, but if you compare districts, well, maybe just provinces, because the districts are too small. If you compare provinces, the ones that are more similar and yet have results that differ. Mm-hmm. If you compare provinces that are very different and have similar results, I mean, you can play around, and that I think would be interesting, because as Paulo's pointing out, that the local elites are going to be very, very different. I mean, we don't really have, or at least I don't know of any work that would really map in a national level the Peruvian elites that you're talking about. I mean, number-wise, I mean, who they are, or even just prosopographically. Even if we're just thinking of who represented provinces in Congress, that work has not really been done. I mean, I have an inkling because I have been studying the Congress for most of the 19th century. In certain provinces, if you look, for instance, in Ancash, you will find that it's only 2 families that ever hold positions in Congress. And you find other departments or provinces where that is different. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot that can come out of this, and then that you can, I mean, it's going to take some effort, because, as I say, some of those studies where you could cross the information are not actually there, but I wouldn't worry too much because the data is actually there.
No, that is interesting. And if you have any ideas of, which, I know some of the, what is fascinating about Peru is that there are a lot of regional studies, which it doesn't, in Argentina it's not that way. And there's a lot of data in Peru that in Argentina we didn't do it. So that's I think that one of the reasons why I just was interested in Peru, one I think is because I couldn't put it in my dissertation because I didn't have, there were some data issues, but I was obsessed with Peru, but also because there is this amount of data that is amazing, that is there, and people have actually written a lot of regional histories, but they haven't put like some of these regional histories together. And Contreras have written a lot about centralization, decentralization, but there are not that many numbers there, so I just know about the tendencies and the trends, and and I know that there are differences between the elites in Puno and what they wanted, and the elites in Lima. But I'm still learning because there's a lot to learn. So
yeah, and then of course going back to that question of how the elites in the different provinces operate, because these local elites are going. For instance, if we think of Puno, the local elites in Puno are intricately linked to the elites in Cusco and in Arequipa, and you find that there's some kind of dynamic there, and then how they are going to be having a different relationship with Lima, because a lot of these local elites are also going to be national representatives. They're going to be either in the Senate and the Congress members, or they're going to be ministers. I mean, the minister you put in Polar is a very famous Arequipeño. So
Puno is also interesting because there were all these Protestant churches
and the border.
developing education in Puno. So I didn't look very carefully at your data, but I think you might find that the literacy rates in Puno are relatively higher than they would have been for the sort of Mancha India. Well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to look and see if your data captures that. Because
well, if it's literacy, it's all the population. So but in 1902 would not capture it because only just to public schools. But in terms of literacy, it should capture the whole population.
I think that particularly in southern departments like that have borders, particularly Puno and Tacna, you're going to find that things are going to be slightly different. And also you have to consider that Tacna, for a large part of this period, is effectively under Chilean control. So, the education provision is coming from the center. But I think that there's lots of things and lots of questions that you can ask your data still, and that I think is very interesting.
Well, thank you.
I haven't. Yes. So you can go first. I'm just thinking in terms of your debate with, or potential debate with Dell and these other people. I mean, in some ways, literacy and enrollment in your model are proxies for education more broadly, right? And yeah, there are no other potential indicators, so that's what we have. But it does raise the question. I mean, for a social historian, it kind of raises the question. Okay, but what are they studying? How effectively are the lessons being learned? I mean, how far can we go with these kind of proxies? Because for later periods, enrollment in Peru is pretty high. It's from Velasco onwards. And yet, Peruvians despair at the fact that they're the lowest ranked on the PISA tables for educational attainment. So, actually being enrolled in school doesn't tell you all that much. If you're interested in debating issues about the persistence of institutions and how that affects economic growth or development or whatever, right? Because in a sense you're dealing with qualitative issues, not just whether kids went to school. So I guess I'm interested in how you will address how you would develop this into an actual debate with the kind of argument that, you know, the Asamoglus and the Dells are
The world. So this is part of like a larger project. So what I'm striving to do is actually look at each of the censuses. So then how 1960, 1971, 1982, 1993, 2003 is the other one. And just look at different measures of educational attainment and look, you know, to match districts over time and see what the losers are with the losers and the winners are with the winners, or there's some kind of reversal of fortune. This is just a part of it, because it will take me years to put this together, because the census of 1960 does not provide district level educational indicators, so I have to go to Peru to get them, and I'm going up for tenure in a year and a half, so I don't have the time. So basically, it's just engaged with that particular. So I just want to see this persistence of outcomes, because if we believe that what happened at the beginning just actually has an influence on what happened at the end, then you should see, like, you know, all the intervening observations that they go in the same direction, right? If they don't, then it's what happened, right? So that is a long-term project, but it will take me some time to do it. In terms of engaging with Gallego, for example, and other, you know, like Mariscal and Sokolov also has this idea of centralization and provision of public education, they generally just look at this monolithic structure of the elite. The elite is this kind of like, it's everything and nothing in between, so there are no fragments, they're all just, you know, kind of the whatever they decided, and you see the observing history, that's what they agreed on, and we move forward, and you don't see the negotiation between local and central elites, and so I'm speaking to, you know, just challenging that part in this particular project, but in the bigger project, that's what I would like to do. And speaking of like how these measures capture actual education or not, there are huge debates about this. It's, you know, intrinsically linked to quality of education. In particular, Latin America, you see very high dropout rates. If you look at, you know, literacy rates in Latin America, except for Guatemala, it's like 98% on average. But they're huge. You know, the dropout rates are very high, and one of the drivers of inequality in Latin America is the gap of educational attainment. Maybe just most people finish maybe primary school, but they don't acquire skills after that. So that is established by the literature, so we are aware of that, but you know, this is the data I have, and for the later periods, I will have kind of wider other ways of looking at it from education perspective, but I was happy that in 1940 I also got schooling, you know, because in 1876 I only had literacy, so.
Can I just say something on that issue, the qualitative aspect? I think that Carlo's right about a lot of the angst, but I think current angst about the pieces goes in the quality and all that. But as you say, I mean, for a very long time, there is a supposedly very high literacy rates in Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of there's a lot of studies that have shown that the actual ability to understand what people read is very low.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't prevent the fact that they actually can read. So I do think that for the period that you're showing here today, I'm not that worried about that not being that big differentiation of what they can just read, or they can read properly, or what do they read, or what do they learn.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're also talking about very high levels of illiteracy
Mm-hmm.
that are dropping. I mean, they're still quite a persistent. So I'm not that concerned for that period. But I do think that for the period that goes after 1940,
Mm-hmm.
as the literacy climbs up, the issue of quality becomes more and more important, particularly as you get towards the present day. I think that then you really do have to
Mm-hmm.
differentiate much more about what you're actually measuring with that.
I'll throw my 2 cents here. It is interesting, and I'm very glad to hear that Peruvian historians find that there is nothing new here. But that should be told to policymakers and economists and development economists that they don't tend to read history or put together this data and assume, either because of lack of data or because they are not really willing to test their assumptions and revise them. Having sort of pledged this compliment for the attempt of an economic historian to reconcile history and evidence and theory and history and economics, I'm going to show you a couple of bombs. You
Bones or anti-bones?
huh?
Bones or anti-bones?
No. You do a huge effort to shed light on the elites. And you haven't shown us something that Paulo hinted, and you plan to capture that on the control these elites have at the local level. So in a way, it's the same story at the local level that we hear from Arroyo, Johnson and the like.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be interesting to see differences within the elites. Or because you also want to capture that through suffrage and elections and so on. And that's something that from political history you can draw from the audience some variables to divide within or categorize and so on. Are these elites, or is this elite's control on education or the budget or whatever a matter of ethnic divide, or this particular economic interest invested in ruling one dictator or another? Because as you say, suffrage is somehow the exclusion of a particular group of people. So are there something specific to these different elites that you can capture? She mentioned two families representing a province, so a bit more on the composition of the elites and so on. Particularly if you want to test this from the accountability. So what are the constraints to the elites, the regional elites? And something that I don't know if you can do, but it will save you a lot of slides, as with the provision of education, you can probably show the number of schools per district.
Not per district.
Or
Per province. Per
And
province,
the
per
variation.
department. Per department.
And think with that. Like, it will save you slides, but I don't know, it creates some expectation about the paper, but you can probably do a shortcut with that. Now, for the point of centralization and decentralization, and I think that you can refer back this to the nature of the elites, or how typical these elites are. At the end of the day, this is all paid, presumably, with local taxes.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to know a bit better what the sources of income of these regions are, and what is the elites' control on that. Because even in the decentralization period, I mean, these are basically direct taxes,
Mm-hmm.
so which is related to the wealth or the capital or the assets that the local people have. So some way to measure the income or the spending of this regional units or districts, whatever, or districts or departments, whatever is the name. Because if not, it is very much a microscopic story of very much the same that so we will be interesting to distinguish either the origin of the elite, the grip the elite has in the political institutions of the province and the representation in the central government, in the absence of federalism and so on. And what are the economic basis of this elite or the source of revenue in different districts, as to see and to assess how much these people invest or don't invest or could invest and they don't. And the same for spending. And finally, do you have different data for level of schooling or type of education institutions? Is all comparable, or is just the spending or the expenditure in primary education or?
So the aggregate level?
Yeah.
So I have primary, secondary.
Because they could be different as to capture what is the function of the elite? This is the function of the elite.
Mhm.
Are they spending more on primary than on tertiary education, or proportionally?
So the data are for the central government, and I put all education together, but it was primary and secondary. But secondary was only 0.6% on average.
So it's
So-
minimal.
So it's minimal.
But within districts as well.
Within districts, I don't know.
You don't have.
I don't have district level spending.
Because if they are spending more on secondary education instead of expending, it is
And-
minimal.
Right.
It's very no, there were very
No,
few
at a
schools.
At a additional level. I mean, in the elite interest to create secondary education, for instance, instead of expanding primary education.
I mean, most districts wouldn't have had a secondary school.
Oh, really?
No,
At all?
they had the colegios normales later, but there were very few. And there are universities that are funded, but there are different sources of funding for universities according to the law. And then the department level revenue for schooling was around 30% of the national level during the centralized period.
I mean, another thing is, I did a bit of work on this in Ayacucho, and there's lots of good stuff in the archives. And they send these inspectors to look at the schools, and the inspectors arrive and there's no school here. They've been reporting that there's a school for several years, and that there was never a school here. And then all these things about teachers not wanting to go to certain places. And so, I mean, I'm not questioning the quality of your data, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence that, schools existed on paper rather than on the ground.
Precisely, some sort of measure of, local grip of the elite or sources or so, because we might be taking this interest of investing in education as, or probably messed up with the word too poor to do it. If this is funded with local money, with local resources, they cannot do it.
During the centralized period, it was not funded just with local.
I mean, the central, you say it is the central. It is more harnessable.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah,
local
but the-
full tax.
Yeah, but the central government was providing funds at 6% of the revenues. It's 5% of the
Was
revenues.
diverted, yeah, but it was distributed in a very different way.
It was no
Is-
that was for the 2 percentage point increase in the tariffs.
In the
That was different. That was distributed in different ways. But for the centralized period, you have that the revenue, the bulk of the revenue came from the central government. There were local taxes, but most of them came from the central
But we don't know
government.
the proportion.
So I know that was around 30% was local of the total
Because
spending.
30% of how large is the 100%? We don't know
So-
how much, say, Tacna spends
Oh,
in
okay.
comparison
So
with Puno, either from the local resources and in relation how much. I mean, it's no compensation. The 5% is distributed across the board, or there is some compensation between the poorer district, some redistribution.
the law doesn't stipulate how it's going to be
And
distributed,
there's no way to know that.
unless just going to
Where the
like-
money comes from? Because we are assigning something to the elite that we cannot
Mhm,
really reveal.
mhm.
And it might also be the case that they don't have the means to do it. Because we have percentages of 100 that we don't know.
I'm inclined to think that it has also to do with one of your initial questions, which has to do about the local demands for education. So I would have the hunch that the more urban, there would be higher demands for education. The more educated, the more higher demand. And then the districts that are further away, where teachers actually don't want to go, maybe it's just as easy as saying, oh, there is a school when there actually isn't one.
Mhm.
So I think that there's many things that are difficult to capture, but are also part of this narrative. I'm not like convinced that it's a question of the inability of
No,
the
no,
localities of
I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that it's difficult. I'm playing the devil's advocate. You cannot distinguish from here if it is they are too poor to build schools or pay teachers. Vis-a-vis that they don't want to do it. They could, but they don't.
I have the feeling that in some case, that what will happen is that if you go into it in more detail, you will find that they have the desire and the ability to pay for schools in certain places, and they won't have it in others.
And what drives that?
I would imagine, again, without real data,
No.
would be the more urban, there would be more demand for the education, and it would be easier to provide. Because it was what you were saying before about how hard is it to put a school in Puno or in Cusco or in Apurimac is going to be different. So I think that there's going to be more penetration the easier it is to have a school. Just as a rule of thumb. I mean, I'm sure that your data would probably show that.
Yeah, so I have
Rural
urbanization rates for both periods. No, well, I have for 1876. I have to collect it for 1940.
But in all these policies about education and funding of education, there is no redistribution of this federal contribution or quota. It is spread equally to every district. Because it's much more expensive to build a school in the middle of the Puno, top of a mountain, than in a in a street in Callao, I believe, because of just the geography and the distance, and relative to the GDP that the wealthiest people have. So the government distributed the money throughout.
So, and in some
exactly.
cases, it allowed some local governments to levy particular taxes. In Ayacucho, they allowed to levy a tax of, 5 cents per 46 kilograms of salt that was exploited. So in some cases, it allowed some other sources.
But most of the money must have gone to pay teachers, not infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't imagine that they were building, what was the school? It was probably
It's
a
like
room in
a
some...
church.
Yeah. So,
It was like, generally, it was like the one-room school.
exactly. So
yeah.
we can kind of assume that most of what little money there was were essentially salaries. So, yeah. I mean, I just think it's just such a precarious system. It's...
How much more expensive it is to persuade somebody to go teach in one place or another? I'm trying to build evidence or to test the argument that this is sort of
Probably Fiona knows.
Right?
Probably Fiona knows.
Yeah, it's a shame Fiona isn't here, because she certainly knows the history of education in Tarma.
Yeah.
She could tell us what happened there. Although, of course, Tarma is a large town, and a lot of your data deals with rural districts. So it's a very different story between Tarma and, say, Huancabamba or Huanta or wherever.
But I think that's what makes your data process so interesting, because we have other ways to know about the city, so we don't usually have a lot of penetration. Because even if the school or the person that was supposed to go to teach in, I don't know, a faraway little town, and they actually didn't go, or they didn't teach, or they only went half a year and they didn't really do it, at least the data points show that someone wanted it to exist. I mean, we can argue on whether it actually existed, or if it was good, or if it was equality, or whatever, but there was some intention. And when you say that in Ayacucho they levied an extra tax from salt, so who initiated that? Was it the local Ayacuchanos who said we need more money because what the central government is giving us is not enough, or no? That goes back to your question of demand.
But in the decentralization period, it's Lima basically to say
Yeah,
there's a school here, there's a school there.
Yeah, but
and then they go and they find, well, actually, we don't need a school here, we need it over there.
Yeah, but I think that your point was that in that period they also could levy extra taxes.
They allowed in some cases. I know of the case of Ayacucho, and it was the central government was saying like this wealth that is produced in Ayacucho does not stay here, so the Ayacuchanos should just actually enjoy part of that wealth.
Because it's not very clear what the different centralization or decentralization makes if we don't know how the central money is allocated. To say, well, no, this is not a matter of the central government. We don't know what I mean, if Paulo was saying, they were deciding on moving the cost, and if there is no federal representation here at the central level, but no, nothing like that. But
There was no federalism.
well, precisely, and they distribute the money, the same money to each, say, of this 5% that you 1% of, or whatever. The same rate to everybody. That is not very federal, or it's a concept. It sort of jumps at a level. The money that each
But
district
there is, I think that
and spend.
I think that there is a significant difference between decentralization and centralization, because the elites, just during the decentralization process, they did not want to provide education. And then they were forced to provide education. Maybe they did. Well, my point is that they didn't provide it equally, and maybe if they were for it, the counterfactual would be a higher level of education. But there is, I think, a significant change in mentality, in the articulation of the national values during this period of time.
You see it in the archives, the correspondence between the Ministry of Instruction in Lima and the prefects is, if they're ordering them, this is what you need to do, this is the new directive. So it makes a big difference. I mean, the extent to which they're effective.
That's what I meant. I don't have any doubt. I mean, there must have huge debates about centralizing or not. But the effect, the way the centralization changes the provisioning, or it's not, we cannot capture that here.
Yeah.
As to distinguish, well, these guys, with the central money, the central government, they hire their cousins, or they went to, that is, this evidence is missing here.
So, okay, so what I do have is number of teachers and schools per department. So that gives you an idea of the inputs that are given to the school provision.
Well, you can have a ratio by the number of students.
Yeah.
Teachers per per student.
Well, that gives you, like an outcome. It doesn't give you, because it doesn't take into account like the number of children that could have gone to school, or because the schools were not there or the teachers were not there in order to meet that demand.
It sounds to me like you really need to have this kind of local level archive-based studies to complement your data, because that's where you will see what the data in the end means in practice. I think that's very doable, because the departmental archives are there. They usually have this kind of correspondence between the Ministry of Education and the prefects and the sub-prefects. But it would be pretty time-consuming, even if you just pick, 2 or 3 case studies. But I think it's really at that level that you'll be able to test what role, local political authorities or power holders have as either enablers or as obstacles to the implementation of education policy. I suspect the church plays an important role as well in some cases. Because in some ways this is taking some responsibilities from the church and handing them to the state.
I guess it's also, there's another interesting gender aspect, is when las primeras letras run by women, kind of household operations. How are those counted and not counted? I mean, are they going to still, because that's more of an earlier 19th century thing, I know. This is kind of the idea that there's going to be a national school with profesoras that have been trained in escuelas normales, and that kind of impetus. It does seem, though, that the central government did have the illusion that education was a panacea. But then, in terms of implementation of it, it did fall short. I mean, the desires, at least at the very top level, seems to have been there.
Well, there was a lot of challenging of the central authority with the preceptores and the inspectors when they were not well received, they were not given data, they just, so there was this kind of contestation, of contesting the authority. So it was not seamless, this transition to a higher provision of education.
And what is the rhetoric, that's for everybody, what is the rhetoric of this centralizing project in terms of, what's the aim and what if it's something like, if you think of Sarmiento or so, Argentina, if they're trying to reach out, or who they're trying to reach out, how they, at least they think they can do that, and there's a clear education policy and endeavors to reach out to everybody and so on, and what's the relation with the local, I mean, what is the literature saying?
Well, more than the literature, going again from the earlier period of the 19th century that I study, I mean, it's always the stated desire of all these kind of nation builders or state builders or whatever, that education is what Peru needs. From the very beginning, from the first constitution of 1823 onwards, there's this idea that the franchise should be limited to those who can read and write, but people have not been educated because of this colonial system, so what Peru needs to do is to get everybody to read and write. So there is that desire, but there's always that kind of choque with the fact that they can't do it. They don't have the funds, they don't have the means, they don't have the possibility. So one of the first things that they do is they say, well, because we can't educate people, we're just going to waive the requirement of them being literate to vote. So that's throughout the 19th century, all the way up to 1896, which is kind of the period that Leticia is looking at, when there's that real fact that, okay, well now, we're no longer going to have people who cannot read and write and vote. So then the idea is, it's important to educate people because that's the way that they're going to start voting. But there's also kind of, I think that I have an intuition that some places in some areas and some local elites would say, we don't necessarily want all these people reading and writing and voting. I mean, there is a whole desire of them reading and writing to become citizens. I mean, it's a question of citizenship because that's the whole premise to where citizenship lies, and the idea that they can read and write. So I think that there might be some local elites that say, well, we don't necessarily want all our peones or the indios or whatever to be able to become citizens. And there's no reason for that. There's no point.
And literacy is the only exclusion, the only mechanism to exclude?
I think in the 1896 law it is, yes.
Yeah, before it was,
After that, it is the only one.
I don't know if in 33 it changes.
no, in 1970s it's lifted.
In 1979 constitution.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure in 1933. I mean, it remains, but I'm not sure if there's other things added to it. I'm not
I
sure.
haven't seen, and the law, I haven't seen the laws that changed that. I think that was the only restriction.
I have the feeling that it was that.
Yeah.
But the point is that the centralization that you start to see around the 1900s is because by 1900 there are national elites. Up to that point there were regional elites or local elites. But by 1900 there are national elites based in Lima. Right? They still have their economic power may still be based in Trujillo or elsewhere, but they're based in Lima. They're reinvesting their money in Lima, and the cosmovision is remaining. And so they start to centralize and they start to strengthen the state in order to break down the power of the remaining local elites. That's what it's all about. And so that's education. It's normal that this process also takes place at the level of education because it's about, educational policy is dictated from the ministry which is located in Lima.
But if it's so, her argument that this is an outcome of the decision of invested regional elites makes no sense.
Well, the thing is
It's
that
a
this is a
mission.
project, but the
It is a
project is
desire.
always resisted. And
Exactly.
you know, what's interesting is that up until Velasco, really, the regional elites maintain a great degree of power. They lose it with Velasco because what the agrarian reform does is that
Shapes their
it
power.
wipes away those regional elites. I mean, they were already very weakened, but you know, still in the 1950s, you know, Arequipa and the South is an important counterweight to Lima. But the centralization measures of, you know, the 1910s, 1920s are about establishing the power of Lima and of the state. I mean, this is a state-building process.
That's how, you know, I would look at the distribution of revenue, where they get the money, how they spend that, how they distribute the central money in the local elites, at the regional level, and how to distinguish if it is the incompetence, inability of the national elite, or the institutional elite have a clout that, in both ways, stops, you know, whoever wants to centralize from Lima or nationalize this elite, and precludes this from top to bottom of becoming better. Though I think that you need also to show, because there's a significant reduction in illiteracy, and we don't know how the population grows there. So we have to, you know, it seems to be like a pretty bad outcome, pretty dismal, but nevertheless.
There were a lot of people that were educated.
It's from 72% to 42. If you have 3 times more people.
Yeah, so you have 2.7 million people in 1976.
How many?
2.7. And I knew you were going to ask this question. And 6.2 million in 1940.
And they reduce illiteracy by 40%.
But the question that I think Leticia is pointing out to is who were the ones who remained illiterate?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
there was an intentionality, not necessarily intentionality.
no, right, but
there was success, sure.
yeah. No, but also to start looking.
No, as I said, there's not a complete failure.
Who's left behind or left out?
I mean, Contreras actually says that it was a failure. Espinosa doesn't say that it's a failure. So Contreras says, like, well, you know, look at 1940, you know, you still have only 2/3 of the school age children do not go to school. And then Espinosa says, hey, look, you know, from 1900 to 1920, see how many funds are allocated, you know, so you see all this progress, look at the number of schools. So you actually see, an acceleration of school building until 1920, and then it just slows down. But you also have that, you know, many of the issues in Peru are contingent upon what's happening on the fiscal side, and because of the sources of revenue are based on customs. You have the Great Depression, which didn't hit to Peru in full force, but still eroded, you know, the fiscal capacity, and you see that, you know, it just kind of slows down, and then it just, you know, it increases again.
And today it was said that Peru has the second greatest GDP growth in the world today. And we should ask how much they're investing in education.
Well, on that jolly note.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
you.
The audience for questions and comments, and so we can. I'm doing celebrate.